gives me great pleasure to be here to talk about India at 75 with the Constitution and beyond. In a sense, before we look at India at 75 and its Constitution in its 75th year, it strikes me that we are looking at a century. We are looking at the 100th year of two philosophies which shaped the Constitution. One philosophy which believes in a glorious past. Its centenary is this year. The RSS was founded in September 1925, and this year will be its centenary. There are elements of what that glorious past looked like, which are to be found in our Constitution. But equally, there is another important centenary which comes from this land. This is also the 100th year of the Vaikom Satyagraha. And the message that went from that Satyagraha, the leaders that evolved from that Satyagraha, including E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar Periyar, their ideas also shaped the Constitution's drive towards equality of status and opportunity and of social justice. So, 75 years ago, when we wrote the Constitution, our forefathers brought forth upon a divided subcontinent a nation conceived as a continuation of an old civilization. India, that is Bharat. It was an idea whose pledge was being redeemed in a post-colonial world. Very few gave it much of a chance. In fact, a quote attributed to Winston Churchill warned, "If independence is granted to India, power will go to the hands of rascals, rogues and freebooters. All Indian leaders will be of low caliber and men of straw. They will have sweet tongues and silly hearts. They will fight among themselves for power, and India will be lost in political squabbles. A day would come when air and water would be taxed in India." I do not know whether if that quote is correctly attributed to Churchill. He had a vision of the current finance minister when he said that even air and water would be taxed. So far it hasn't gone there, but you must remember that Churchill warned us. Now, so in some senses, it's a wonder that we have lasted this long, 75 years. It's a wonder that our Constitution has lasted this long. At the same time that we were writing our Constitution, Sri Lanka brought in, Sri Lanka's Ceylon as it was called then, brought in the British constitutional expert, Sir Ivor Jennings, to write their Constitution. Ivor Jennings had criticized the Indian Constitution as just a continuation of the 1935 Government of India Act and predicted that it would not long last. Ivor Jennings' masterpiece in Sri Lanka lasted about a decade or less. And here we are at 75, still going on, and going on with a greater sense of public involvement and of public ownership of the Constitution. You see, what are our constitutional rights? Many of us read about it, learn about it in civics and all, and we think that we have that magical institution on Bhagwan Das Road which will always come to the aid of the citizen against the despotic state. But no, the Constitution is a little bit more than that. And a Constitution will not work until the people decide to work it. Until the people decide that the rights that are there in the Constitution belong not only to them, but belong to each of their brothers and sisters and fellow citizens of India. It was the tribals at Patalgadi, a place in Jharkhand, who put out their rights out on stones, carved them on stones and on notice boards outside their villages to tell officers, we know we have rights. It was 3 girls in a school, in a government junior college in my hometown of Udupi, who when faced with a bigoted teacher, told her that no, we have a constitutional right to freedom of our religion and we want to express our identity and our modesty by wearing a hijab. 3 judges of the Bangalore High Court disagreed. Matter went to the Supreme Court and 1 judge has agreed. The matter is still at large. But what happens ultimately in the matter we do not as yet know. But what we do know is that little men, little women, our fellow brothers, our fellow sisters are now invested in the Constitution. And when the early writers of the Constitution like Granville Austin said that first and foremost the Constitution is a social document, they probably did not envisage how deeply it would go into Indian society. If you look at the basis of Indian society, often, it is our conception that we all owe our families, our people, our country, duties. We are all people of karmanya vadikaraste. But it was indeed a social revolution when Thomas Paine's book, The Rights of Man, fell into the hands of a gardener from Maharashtra in translation, in Marathi translation. And when the magic lines there saying man hath no property in man went before Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, it was then that the idea of an equalized society was born. A society which could be made more equal through education, through a constant assertion of rights. And from Phule down to Ambedkar's Mahat Satyagraha and to Ambedkar being co-opted to write the Constitution, there is a direct line of thought. You know, one of the great things or the happy coincidences of that time was that the chairman of the drafting commission was Dr. Ambedkar, who would not have been a member of the Constituent Assembly of India had there not been an act of extraordinarily reaching out across the aisle. Dr. Ambedkar had been elected to the Constituent Assembly from a place which was in East Pakistan, which finally, with the help of one Mr. Jogendranath Mandal, who later became the first law minister of Pakistan. Having lost his seat there because that went to Pakistan, he had to be re-elected to the Constituent Assembly. And it was Mahatma Gandhi who suggested that he be brought back into the Constituent Assembly. And that's why he was elected from Bombay and then made chairman of the drafting committee. Now, why did you must remember that Mahatma Gandhi and Ambedkar never got along. They never got along since their first meeting when the Mahatma saw a fair man a fair complexioned man who spoke good English, who was deeply concerned about the depressed classes, and the Mahatma made a classic mistake. He assumed he was a Brahmin who was concerned about depressed classes. The relationship got off on a rocky start and then worsened with the Pune Pact, which was forced upon Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar's political life from the 30s to the mid 40s was all about being part of the establishment, being part of the Viceroy's Council, but equally not fully integrating, not really being thought of as a pan-Indian leader. And to bring him on board was an act of great statesmanship, and it was there that we had a galaxy of people, not only Dr. Ambedkar, we had B.N. Shivrao, we had Muhammad Sadullah, and a lot of the great legal minds of Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, all of the great legal minds of that day who came around with a particular document which had both rights as well as directive principles which cast a kind of line or a vision statement for the future. And why did they come out with that magnificent document the way they did it? One thing that strikes me is that they wrote it against a backdrop of violence, of very great violence of the previous decade. You must remember that the Constituent Assembly finally signed the Constitution on 26th of November 1949. But please cast your mind to the violence of the previous decade. You had the World War, you had partition violence, you had the atom bomb, you had the Jewish Holocaust, you had the murder of the Mahatma. All these events worked on the minds of the assembly to tell them, look, this is where great danger lies. Unfortunately, and after a couple of generations, we seem to have forgotten the lessons that our forefathers so painfully learned. Today, we are again at 75. We are in a situation where we have to renew our constitutional vows. We have, for the sake of our children, for the sake of our grandchildren, got to preserve what was not revealed scripture, but a document which had been crafted against a backdrop of violence, a document which had been crafted against a breakdown of constitutional protections. It was basically because the two sides in 1947 were unable to come to an agreement on suitable constitutional provisions which would ensure that everybody had a voice, that we ended up in a partition. Today, strangely enough, in an era of an autocratic government, people are now again invested in the constitution. I spoke of the tribals of Patalgadi, I spoke of the hijab-wearing girls of Udupi, and the last elections has shown us that people value it. The thought that the constitution and its protections can be hollowed out, the cry that Samvidhan khatre mein hai, has to a certain extent worked. But it is not enough to cry that khatre mein hai. What we have to work at is to ensure that A, we treat that document with respect. B, we live the values, the social values that the Constitution espouses, that everybody works towards liberty, equality, fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual. When we ensure that each individual citizen of India is assured his dignity, is assured of economic justice, of a full stomach, a roof over his head, and the freedom from fear of violence, of arbitrary arrest, that there are institutions and people who are designed to protect these values, that is when we will have a people's constitution which we are both owners of and masters of. That is an India which I would like to see, and hopefully we are all around when the Indian Constitution is at its century, and we can tell our children and our grandchildren, look, we preserved it. It is now your job to take it further. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for a very patient hearing. Thank you.